How does the 3700X compare to the 1700X if you're a gamer? Now in this video, I'm not going to have any productivity benchmarks. This is aimed specifically at gamers. So, should you upgrade? Now straight off the bat, the system that I'm going to use to compare these two CPUs I think is fairly representative of the kind of system somebody would have paired with a Ryzen 7 1700X. So in other words, one of the things that I'm testing today is if you bought a fairly high-end system in 2017, is there any point to just dropping in a 3700X, or how much of a difference does it make? Now the GPU that I'm using is a GTX 1080. I'm using 32 gigs of HyperX Predator RGB memory, which I overclocked to 3400 megahertz for both of the CPUs. Now the only thing in this setup that isn't representative of a 2017 Ryzen system is the motherboard, which is actually an X470 Crosshair Hero from Asus. But honestly, it shouldn't affect the performance too much compared to an X370 variant. Now as far as cooling goes, I'm using a Hyper 212 Black Edition, which isn't a particularly high-end cooling solution, but it is better than the actual box cooler that is included with the 3700X, so I think we'd still be able to get pretty good performance. Now, finally moving on to the actual CPUs and what setup I use them in. For the 1700X, I overclocked it to 3.95 gigahertz, which is the highest stable gaming core clock I can get on this CPU. In regards to the 3700X, I overclocked it to 4.25 gigahertz. Now, I do want to point out that it wasn't rock solid at this core clock. It wasn't nearly as stable as the 1700X was, but regardless of what core speed I was running at, the 3700X was fairly unstable on this motherboard. And then for those of you interested, the BIOS version that I used is 2406. Now, it doesn't use the AGESA code that was retracted, but it is one of the earliest compatible BIOSes for this motherboard with the Ryzen 3000 CPUs, and people seem to be having stability issues all over the place. So it will get better as time goes on. Now let's move on to the actual games that I used for these tests. Now it's pretty much my standard benchmark suite. The reason that I use these games is because they're the most popular games on the market at the moment. This is purely to see in a realistic gaming situation what the CPU performs like compared to the 1700X. Now I tested all of these games at both 720p and 1080p Ultra settings, and then for a couple of the games that I know that some people are interested, I actually tested them at low settings for both of these resolutions as well. So with that out the way, let's have a look at how these two CPUs compare and whether or not you should actually upgrade. Now the first game is CSGO, and at 1080p Ultra settings there isn't a very big difference between the CPUs. If you look at the 720p Ultra settings, which is the kind of sweet spot for testing CPU performance with the graphics card that I have, you can see there's a much bigger difference, especially when it comes to the average frame rates. Now when moving on to Apex, there isn't much of a difference. In fact, it seems as though Apex isn't very CPU bound as a title. In fact, at 720p, the 3700X actually has worse 0.1% lows than the 1700X, but you do have to bear in mind that these are games that you test while gaming online on a server, so there is also variations with that. But I did use the same location for all of the runs, so I tried to minimize variation as much as possible. Far Cry 5 seems to have quite a big CPU bottleneck because there isn't much of a difference between 720p and 1080p for both of the CPUs, but there is quite a big difference between the two CPUs. When it comes to Fortnite is also not the most CPU bound game, it seems. Now with GTA 5, there was a fair amount of difference between the two CPUs, especially when looking at the 0.1% lows at 720p. The 3700X does actually kind of make a case for itself there. And then finally, when looking at PUBG, this is one of the games where there was a fairly perceptible difference between the two CPUs. At Ultra settings for 720p, there's quite a big jump in 0.1% lows going to the 3700X. And that's actually the case across the board. When you look at the low settings, again, there is a fair amount of difference between the 3700X and the 1700X, but with low settings, that margin is smaller. Now, I do actually want to add a subjective point to this, a point of, could I actually feel a difference between the two CPUs? Now, this is something that's quite difficult to be objective about because there is obviously a placebo effect and you're not testing them back to back necessarily, but there is a little bit of a difference, especially with PUBG. It made a difference when it comes to the stutters and the extent of the stutters. Now, I was doing all of these tests on a 1080p 144Hz monitor, and with the 1700X, when playing PUBG, you'd be like, oh, there's a stutter, oh, there's a stutter, oh, there's a stutter. The stutters were all pretty clear and obvious. But when moving over to the 3700X, it turned from, oh, there's a stutter, to, wait, was that a stutter? So in PUBG specifically, the stutters were less perceptible, but they were still kind of there. The CPU upgrade didn't completely remove the stutters. And with that, I think if you have a 1700X with a fairly reasonable graphics card, something like a GTX 1080, so not like a super high-end GPU like a 2080 Ti, I think there's not much of a reason for you to upgrade. Even if you're gaming at 144Hz at 1080p, you will get better results, but I don't think it's worth an upgrade at this point. However, I think if you have something like a 1600 or maybe a 2400G, there is more of a case to upgrade to a 3700X. And honestly, if you're in the market for a CPU, I think the 3700X is an amazing all-round CPU. Again, go and have a look at some of the other benchmarks where people compare this CPU to all of the other CPUs on the market at the moment so that you can make an informed decision about what CPU to buy for your specific use case. And with that, I think it brings me to the end of the video. Thank you very much for watching. If you liked the video, like and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this one. And until the next video, bye-bye.